Global coherence. In a previous video, I talked about the maxims of Grice. These are the maxims of conversation, and the idea is that writing a good research paper means that you're having a conversation with your readers. And one of Grice's maxims is be relevant. This is important when we talk about coherence. And what I'm going to argue in this lecture is that coherence is relevance. Readers expect everything in a paper to be relevant to the paper's thesis. So in another video, I talk about how the thesis is the main point of the paper. That's the single sentence that you want readers to take away from your paper and remember if they forget everything else. And everything in the paper should be relevant to that thesis. So once a reader has identified the thesis, they expect everything else in there to somehow be connected to that thesis. It's the writer's job to make the relevance apparent. This brings us back to that word coherent. What we often hear is a reader will look at a piece and say, oh, that piece was incoherent, or worse yet, the writer was incoherent. But in my experience, it's not the case from the writer's point of view. From the writer's point of view, they know what they wanted to say, they know their argument, they know how everything is connected, that is how everything is relevant. The issue is that the reader couldn't see the relevance. And when the reader can't see the relevance, then it's incoherent to the reader. And that's the important thing, is that incoherence isn't something that you can point to in a paper itself. Incoherence is an artifact of how a reader views the paper. That doesn't mean that it's not the writer's responsibility to make sure that it is coherent for the reader. That is very much the job of a writer. And a reader gets frustrated when they can't see how things are relevant. So if readers can't see how everything's related, they become frustrated. So the question is, what counts as relevant? Well, a number of things, as it turns out. One is context. So if we can contextualize something, that's going to be relevant to a reader. Also, support. In a previous video, I talked about the structure of an argument where everything is supporting the main point of the paper. So that's clearly going to be relevant to the reader. Evidence. In a research paper, everything hinges ultimately on the quality of the writer's evidence. So clearly the evidence is going to be highly relevant to the rest of the paper. An explanation, right? So anytime that you are discussing something, you should also explain it. Terminology, concepts, theories, whatever it is, readers expect an explanation. And methodology. So if a writer is writing a primary research paper, they need to go over the methodology that they used in order to verify their evidence. In a secondary research paper, the methodology may not be quite as important, but there are certainly times when the writer needs to go over the methodology that the writers, the researchers that they're using to document, to bolster their argument, they go over those writers' methodology. So again, it's not the writer's methodology, but the sources that the writer is using. That methodology in a secondary research paper can be highly relevant at times. Reasoning, the logic that we are using to get from point A to point B, to get from our evidence to our reasons, and from our reasons to our claims, our points, that is highly relevant. Other points of view. This is one of those things that may seem counterproductive at first from a writer's point of view. Why would you want to explore people who disagree with you? Why would you want to explore hypothetical points of view that are contrary to our own? But in fact, that turns out to be highly relevant. And then in fact, it ultimately can strengthen our own argument because readers now see that we've considered alternatives to our own view and ultimately arrived at our conclusions. Reflection. This is generally going to be reserved towards the end of a paper, where we start reflecting on the bigger picture, on why our argument is important. In the end, everything has to be mutually relevant, and that relevance is how it ties to the thesis of the paper. If the reader can't see how it's all connected, then they get frustrated.